The sun had just peeked over the horizon, its first warm rays illuminating the lush green fields of the farm. The only sound was a gentle rustle of the wind through the trees and the soft footsteps of Jack Callahan, a middle-aged man and a former Navy SEAL, stepping out from his humble wooden porch. Jack's eyes gazed far away, directed toward the hazy mountains on the horizon, where the rolling hills evoked the peace he always longed for. He stood there for a long while, sipping coffee from a time-worn porcelain cup, each rich sip serving as a way to momentarily forget the deep wounds in his heart. Today was just like any other day. No one called him awake at 4 a.m., no one shouted in his face during tense meetings, and there was no noise or anxiety about some looming task. It was just him, the dogs, the herd of goats, and the old tractor things he had spent many years growing attached to. Jack smiled softly as he watched the goats leisurely munching on the grass near the pen. A sense of peace washed over him, as if he had found a place that truly belonged to him, where no one but him and these quiet creatures could intrude. This was a life he had always dreamed of after leaving the military, a life free from conflict, free from stress. He stopped in front of the fence, his hand resting on the rough wooden slats. Suddenly, he looked up, gazing down the narrow path leading into the farm, as if someone were watching him from afar. A smile briefly crossed his lips, only to vanish just as quickly. It was just a fleeting feeling. As Jack turned back into the house to get ready for breakfast, a white SUV suddenly appeared at the end of the driveway, rolling over the gravel. He spotted the vehicle from the window, and an uneasy feeling washed over him. Who could possibly be here this early in the morning? Jack wondered. For the past few months, life on his farm had been quiet, with no strangers coming by. Guessing that someone might need help, he stepped outside, still holding his coffee cup. The car came to a stop right in front of the fence. The door swung open and a woman stepped out. Karen Simmons, dressed in a pastel khaki outfit and oversized sunglasses, stood there soaking up the sunlight like a goddess from the city. She looked nothing like someone who worked in agriculture. Instead, she resembled a businesswoman ready to embark on a serious inspection. Jack didn't recognize her, but instinctively, he sensed that something was off. Karen approached him, not with the casual steps of an ordinary visitor, but like someone on a mission. She raised her hand in greeting, an oddly formal gesture in this setting. "Hello, sir," Karen said, her tone sweet as if they were meeting at an intimate party. "I'm Karen Simmons, the president of the Simmons Valley Homeowners Association. I'm here to welcome you to our community." Jack stood frozen, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Karen Simmons? Homeowners Association? He couldn't believe his ears. This farm of his was neither a residential area nor under the jurisdiction of any association. Karen smiled gently and continued, "We are a legal community, responsible for maintaining standards of appearance and environment for the properties in the area. I just came to introduce myself, but I also need to mention that you will have to adhere to some community regulations." Jack couldn't help but laugh. Standards of appearance? What are you talking about? This is farmland, not a city. "That's right," Karen replied, completely unflustered. "But we also have regulations regarding fencing, structures, livestock ratios, and noise." She pulled out an envelope. "This is our guideline packet. Everything will kick off next month." Jack flipped the paper in his hand. Seeing the ridiculous regulations, the aerial photos of the livestock pen, even the satellite dish was deemed a visual issue. He looked back at Karen, his eyes turning cold and resolute. "What am I supposed to do?" Jack asked, his voice growing somber. Karen showed no surprise at his attitude. "We're just asking you to follow the community rules. If not, there will be necessary interventions." Jack didn't respond right away. He quietly tore the paper into tiny pieces and tossed them into the trash. The fire in his eyes began to blaze, but he said nothing. Only one feeling surged within him, an unwavering resolve. The next day, when Jack went outside to tend to the livestock and prepare for the farming work, he noticed something unusual. A white sign was tied to the fence with a zip tie, standing out against the peaceful backdrop of the farm. The sign read, "Property under review must comply with Simmons Valley HOA regulations." Jack stood frozen, his eyes glued to the sign. He recalled his meeting with Karen the day before, Her words about the regulations had been far from convincing, but this was the first time he had seen an official sign like this right on his own land. "It's them again," Jack muttered under his breath, then yanked the sign down with force. Without hesitation, he tossed it into the nearby fire pit and watched until it was completely reduced to ashes. But that was not the end. Right after the sign was burned down, Jack knew that his peaceful days wouldn't last long. As he returned to his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, lurking just ahead. And as if it were meant to be, the very next morning, a new sign appeared, bigger and firmly nailed to the fence. This time, it wasn't just one sign. A whole series of signs were nailed along the road leading to the farm. Jack froze as he looked at the large sign plastered on the door of his barn, a place he had always felt was the safest and most peaceful spot. Under the supervision of the HOA, there's a requirement to adhere to strict regulations. Jack stepped closer, his fists clenched tight. He felt a simmering anger deep inside. This was no longer a joke. To him, these weren't just meaningless signs. This was an invasion of his freedom, a way for strangers to try to control every inch of the land he had sweated and bled to call his own. Even though he felt an increasing sense of threat, Jack decided to act as if nothing was happening. He continued with his work, ignoring the signs and the ridiculous threats from the HOA. However, what he didn't expect was that just a few days later, while Jack was sitting on his porch sipping coffee, he saw two men in khaki jackets, wearing badges that read HOA Patrol, stepping out of a black truck parked on the gravel road. They stepped onto his property as if they were on a mission, holding papers and a walkie-talkie. Jack didn't rush to go outside. He just stood by the window, watching, his heart racing with anticipation. Both of them started walking along the fence, chatting with each other over their walkie-talkies. Jack noticed that one of them was looking toward his tractor and pointing at it, seemingly taking notes. Suddenly, one of them turned around, saw Jack standing there, and quickly walked toward the main gate. Jack didn't lose his cool. He stood up and stepped outside, his eyes never leaving them. The two men immediately froze, their faces paling as they spotted Jack, as if they'd been caught by a wild animal. "Can I help you guys with anything?" Jack spoke up, his tone calm but laced with suspicion. One of the two men, who seemed to be the team leader, looked at Jack and replied, "We're conducting a compliance inspection as required by the HOA. We'll be checking everything from the fence to the structures on your property." Jack smirked and slowly stepped closer. "You don't have the right to be here without my permission," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. The team leader looked a bit flustered, then held up a small badge. "We are the HOA enforcement officers, authorized to conduct inspections under the community regulations." Jack stared at the card, then turned back to look at the two men. "I don't see any rules that allow you to trespass on my property. You can leave right now, or I will call the police." The atmosphere was as tense as a guitar string. But instead of getting angry, the man just forced a smile and quickly signaled for his teammates to leave. Before walking away, he left a small note that read, "Violation check in progress. First warning." Jack stood on the porch, watching their figures fade away. The feeling of anger stemmed not just from the direct invasion of his space, but also from the realization that this confrontation was not a one-time thing. HOA was not simply an organization to maintain order. They had deeper schemes that he didn't fully grasp yet. From this moment on, Jack decided that he would not let them manipulate his life any longer. He had lived through much more stressful situations in the military, and he knew that now he had to apply everything he had learned. At night, Jack began preparing for the next confrontation. He checked all the security devices on the farm, installed additional motion sensors, and positioned cameras in strategic locations around the property. He also planned to use military tactics he was familiar with, not to attack, but to defend and protect his freedom. In the days that followed, the silence was broken by the incursions of the HOA. But this time, Jack wasn't just waiting anymore. He had everything prepared, and he knew that this battle was just beginning. On a moonlit night, Jack woke up, listening to every tiny sound in the stillness around him. He couldn't sleep. An unsettling feeling clung to him. Outside, the wind blew softly, but Jack could hear the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel outside the farm. It wasn't the sound of an animal or strangers casually passing by. This was the sound of something approaching, and this time they weren't coming quietly like before. Jack stood up, quietly making his way to the window. The scene outside was dim in the darkness, but his eyes had adjusted to this stillness. He saw the silhouettes of 3 men walking onto his property. They were dressed in khaki uniforms, wearing badges that read HOA Patrol, and carrying documents that looked just like the last time. This time, they no longer hesitated. Their steps seemed more purposeful, as if they knew Jack wouldn't back down without a fight. But Jack was ready. He stepped back, reached out to the light switch, and within seconds, the powerful beams from his headlights illuminated the entire area. The loud blaring from the alarm system rang out, causing the others to freeze in their tracks. With all the calmness he could muster, Jack stepped outside. Even though he had no weapon in hand, his gaze was enough to make the 3 of them feel uneasy. They exchanged glances, but none of them dared to move forward. "Do you think I'm just going to stand here?" Jack spoke up, his voice deep and resolute. "You have no right to be here." One of the 3 men spoke up. "Try and stay calm. We're on a mission, Mr. Callahan. This is a request from the HOA. Jack stepped closer, his eyes locked on them. "Don't you get it? You have no rights here. I won't let you invade my life." The tense situation stretched on for several seconds. Jack felt the weariness rise within him, but he couldn't stop fighting. This wasn't just about this piece of land. It was about his freedom, his right to not be violated. Everything had reached a boiling point, and now was the time for him to stand up. Finally, after a brief silence, the other 3 turned their backs and stepped away without saying a word. They didn't dare to continue. Jack stood there, his hands clenched into fists, but he wasn't in a hurry. He knew this fight wasn't over yet. The next morning, as the dawn lit up the farm, Jack sat inside the house, holding a cup of coffee, reflecting on what had happened. He knew this time they wouldn't back down easily. But Jack also understood one thing. This fight was his alone, and if he wanted to protect his freedom, he would have to fight to the bitter end. And he was ready. The inspections from the HOA, the ridiculous schemes from Karen, everything was set for a bigger showdown. Jack understood that he could no longer rely on peace. He had fought in the military, and now he would fight to protect what was rightfully his. In silence, Jack pulled out a small notebook and opened to the handwritten pages he had prepared long ago. These were his defense plans, action strategies for the worst-case scenarios. He glanced at the words on the page, then lifted his gaze to the window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to break. Jack knew that he would never return to his old life, where everything was stable and there were no challenges. This battle had only just begun. The next day, when Jack woke up, the warm morning light streamed through the window into his simple kitchen. The smell of coffee mingled with the fresh country air, the perfect blend to kickstart a new day. But today was different from the days before. A sense of unease lingered around him, like a ghost that wouldn't leave, no matter how hard he tried to shake it off. As he sat sipping his coffee and gazing out the window, his eyes suddenly landed on the dirt road leading into the farm. Unfamiliar trucks were parked there, and men in khaki uniforms were stepping out. Jack felt his heart race, not out of fear, but from anxiety. He stepped outside and surveyed the scene. In the distance, he spotted a black truck parked outside his property, with a group of 3 men making their way into the farm. All 3 were dressed in khaki uniforms, carrying paperwork and walkie-talkies. They didn't look like your typical visitors. They seemed serious and had a clear purpose. As they approached, Jack couldn't shake the tense feeling in the air. He noticed one of them holding a piece of paper, looking over the areas near his livestock pen, seemingly taking notes on everything. Jack felt like he was being held back in that moment. He realized that this was no longer just a routine incident. "Hello, Mr. Callahan." One of the team members spoke up, their tone lacking any warmth or discussion. "We're conducting a property inspection at the request of the HOA. Jack wasn't surprised, but he still couldn't help feeling annoyed. "You guys again," he replied, his voice calm but tinged with irritation. "You don't have the right to trespass on my land without clear permission." The man holding the paperwork looked back at Jack, showing no signs of fear. He simply nodded slightly and said, "We are the oversight team appointed by the HOA. Any violations of the regulations will be documented and dealt with according to the law. Jack looked at the men, then slowly walked closer. You have no authority here. I don't need you interfering in my work. The others didn't respond right away, but Jack could clearly feel the tension in their eyes. He knew they weren't just here to inspect things. This wasn't just about the signs or some vague regulations anymore. This was an invasion of his personal freedom. They weren't just checking his land. They were trying to control his life. Although Jack didn't want to create more conflict, this time he was determined not to back down. The silence hung heavily in the air. He paused for a moment, looked straight into the eyes of those standing before him, and said, "You guys can't do anything. I'm not going to accept these unreasonable demands anymore. You can leave here right now, or I will call the police." One of them, the team leader, seemed hesitant for a moment, but then he just gave a forced smile and said, "We're just doing our job. You can cooperate and avoid trouble." Jack wasn't backing down. He had been patient long enough. "I've had enough of this. You have no right to invade my property. You can leave right now." After a brief moment of silence, the three men said nothing more. They turned their backs and walked away, leaving Jack standing there, a sense of frustration and tension clinging to him. He knew that this time they wouldn't give up easily. This was just a part of their bigger plan. As soon as the three men left the farm, Jack stepped inside the house and shut the door behind him. He glanced at the old wooden table in the living room where a map of his land lay. His eyes stared at it for a few minutes, contemplating what had just happened. The HOA representatives couldn't reach him this time, but he knew they wouldn't give up. He walked over to a wooden cabinet that held old tools and supplies, pulling out items he knew he would need if those people came back. Some were basic security devices, while the rest were strategies he had learned from the military. This is going to be a long battle, Jack thought to himself as he grabbed a notebook and began to sketch out a defense plan. He not only had to protect his land, but also had to deal with those who were trying to take control of his life. He took a notebook and started jotting down the locations for sensors, cameras, and other security devices around the farm. He also mapped out worst-case scenarios he might encounter. Jack was not only preparing for defense, but also mentally gearing up for a long confrontation. The next day, as the sun was just rising, Jack stood on the porch looking out. Everything still seemed peaceful, but he couldn't shake that feeling. The tension hung thick in the air. He knew this time the HOA wouldn't just stop at sending someone to inspect. They had started making threats, and that could lead to a much bigger invasion. Just as expected, just a few days later, a truck parked near the trail leading to the farm. A group of people got out of the vehicle, this time appearing to be better equipped. They carried tools similar to the last time, but this time they seemed much more determined. Jack didn't hesitate. He stepped outside, his hands resting on the supplies he prepared earlier, feeling a fresh sense of determination. He couldn't let them control his life any longer. This would be the final showdown. As night fell, the air grew colder, and Jack knew tonight would be different from any other night. He sat in the living room, gazing out the window, his heart racing with unease. This time, the tension was undeniable. Everything had escalated, and it was no longer just a game of ridiculous rules. This was a fight for freedom, a battle between Jack and those who want to control his life. He was ready. Motion sensors, security cameras, and an alarm system were all set up around the farm. Tonight, if the HOA dared come back, they wouldn't be able to get close as easily as before. Jack told himself that this time, he wouldn't give them a chance. In the stillness of the late night, as darkness enveloped the land, a sound echoed from outside. Jack froze, his heart racing as he heard the soft footsteps gliding over the gravel. He sat in silence, listening intently to the sound. It wasn't the noise of animals or the usual ranch hands. This was purposeful, calculated footsteps. Jack stood his ground without a hint of hesitation. He got up and carefully made his way to the window. The darkness couldn't hide the glow from the floodlights, the lights from the security system he had set up. He could see figures moving in an organized manner along the fence. It was the same group of people he had faced earlier. This time, they weren't just a small group. Jack realized they had brought extra equipment, perhaps more powerful weapons. They moved through the darkness, making no sound, but Jack was ready. He quietly turned around, approached the wooden table, and pressed a button on the small remote. Instantly, bright lights from the overhead floodlights flickered on, illuminating the entire area. The people outside were overwhelmed by the sudden light. Stopping for a few seconds, caught off guard, Jack didn't give them a chance to keep moving. He quickly stepped outside, gripping the wooden gate bar tightly. The HOA members stood silently, showing no signs of surprise. They had known that a confrontation was inevitable, but they never expected Jack to be so well prepared. The bright light shone into their eyes, forcing them to squint. Jack stepped out, not in a rush, but his stride radiated determination. Each step he took seemed to affirm that he would not allow them to do anything illegal anymore. "Back again, are you?" Jack said, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "I told you, you don't have the right to be here." One of the men, the team leader, stepped forward and looked at Jack. "We're just following orders, Mr. Callahan. This is a directive from the HOA. We have the right to inspect your property." Jack stared at the man, then shook his head. "You might be whatever you think you are, but you have no right to invade my property. You can leave here right now." The situation grew tenser. The others said nothing, but the silence felt like a clear declaration of war. Jack sensed the atmosphere was on the verge of exploding. He watched as they slowly pulled weapons from their pockets, the handguns drawn swiftly. But Jack wasn't scared at all. He stood tall, his eyes locked on them. "What do you want?" Jack asked, his voice dropping. "If you don't leave right now, I'll have to take serious action." The team leader, seemingly ready for this confrontation, glanced at his teammates. One of them pulled out a gun and aimed at Jack. But in an instant, Jack moved swiftly, grabbing the binoculars from the shelf to get a closer look at the situation outside. Jack knew this wasn't just an ordinary confrontation. Everything had crossed the line. This was an attack on his freedom, and he wouldn't let them succeed. He just needed one chance to fight back. Jack didn't say another word. He nodded slightly, then pressed a button on his wristwatch. Instantly, a blaring alarm filled the air. The floodlights illuminated not just the ground, but also lit up the towering poles surrounding the farm, creating a halo of light around the property. At the same time, loudspeakers blared a powerful warning sound, causing the HOA members to halt in their tracks, stepping back in retreat. "You guys don't have another chance," Jack said, his voice no longer calm like before. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, the situation would only get worse. The others didn't want to confront him directly. They exchanged glances for a moment before turning away and walking off. None of them wanted to face Jack's fierce resistance. As the last shadows of people faded away, Jack stood there for a long moment, taking a deep breath. He felt the tension slowly easing out of his body. Even though there hadn't been a real battle, the feeling of victory surged within him. He had succeeded this time. But Jack knew that the threat wasn't over. The HOA group would be back, and next time, it could be even more dangerous. Jack returned home and shut the door behind him. He looked out the window, where the headlights still blazed brightly in the darkness. He knew he needed to prepare even better for the days ahead. These people wouldn't stop until they achieved their goal. It was a battle that Jack couldn't avoid. But he also knew one thing. He wouldn't give up. This was his farm, and he would protect it no matter what he had to face. The next day, sunlight peeked through the window as Jack sat on an old wooden chair in the living room, staring at the farm's map. In his mind, strategies had long been laid out. The security system was activated, but that wasn't enough. He knew the HOA wouldn't back down. They had crossed the line, and now it was time for him to respond with even more force. Jack stood up and walked over to a small table where he kept his notebook. He opened it up, and the first page was filled with careful notes about all the access routes to the farm, spots that could easily be targeted, and the weaknesses in his defense system. He marked the areas that needed improvement, from the surveillance cameras to the motion sensors. "I won't let them take control of my life," Jack told himself, his hand gliding over the words in his notebook. He thought of a longer-term strategy, not just a battle with the HOA, but a patient and clever plan that would unfold over time. He knew they could come back at any moment, and this time he would be ready for it. A week later, Jack was working outside, checking on the goats and fixing the fence. A black car was parked at the end of the dirt road, leading to his farm. By now, he was used to unexpected visitors, but this time, the car didn't just stop by chance. A middle-aged man stepped out of the vehicle, dressed neatly, with his hair parted and wearing dark sunglasses. Jack stared intently, a feeling of unease rising within him. This man was not one of the HOA staff. He didn't have a name tag, nor was he dressed in a uniform like the others before him. He looked more like someone with authority. As the man approached, Jack stood tall, his voice cold. "I don't know you, and you're not welcome here." The man smiled, his gaze somewhat assessing. "I'm Martin Ellison. I'm not here because of the HOA, but for a special project. I'd like to talk to you about some issues under consideration regarding this area." Jack squinted. He didn't trust anyone from the HOA, especially not someone who looked like a high-level expert. "What project?" Jack asked, unable to hide his skepticism. Martin stepped closer, his voice soft yet firm. "Do you know anything about our rural management program? We're conducting assessments in areas with potential for development. Your farm is on the list for review." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The rural management program? He had never heard that name before. But from Martin's gaze and words, he knew all too well that this wasn't the first time they had set their sights on his land. "My land is not for them to test or seize," Jack said, but inside his anxiety was rising even higher. Martin continued to smile, but that smile offered no comfort. "You can understand what we're doing. This isn't just about your property. It's part of a long-term plan to ensure the sustainable development of the area. I hope you can cooperate." "No," Jack replied, his voice firm. "I won't cooperate with organizations that want to control my life." Mar was not intimidated at all, but he didn't say anything more. He simply placed a red-sealed envelope down on Jack's palm and turned away, leaving without another word. Jack stared at the envelope, feeling that something monumental and dangerous was looming closer. He knew this was the moment he had to do something stronger to protect not just his land, but also his freedom. Right after Martin left, Jack picked up the envelope, opened it, and read the words inside. It was a letter requesting cooperation, but hidden within was a threat. They wouldn't stop if he refused. They demanded Jack cooperate or face stronger measures, including the seizure of his property, without any warning. Jack placed the letter down on the table, clenching his fists. He couldn't let these people take over his life. He had fought his whole life for what he had, and now it was time for him to stand up and protect what he cherished. Battles don't just happen on the battlefield. Sometimes the biggest fight is to protect personal freedom. Jack decided he wouldn't back down. He would dig into the rural management program that Martin mentioned and uncover the loopholes in their plan. In the days that followed, Jack didn't just stick to preparing standard defense measures anymore. He began gathering information, researching the organizations that might be linked to the program Martin mentioned. He tapped into all his connections, including some old friends from the police force and the military. Every night, Jack kept reinforcing his defenses. He rearranged the cameras, installed more motion sensors, and even boosted the power of the electric barriers. He knew that this time, the enemy wouldn't give up easily, but with each step he took in preparation, Jack felt himself growing stronger than ever. Every time he thinks about what he has to face, he becomes even more determined. At this point, there's no room for doubt or fear. This is his battle, and he won't let anyone take away what he has built. All day long, Jack couldn't take his eyes off the envelope that Martin Ellison had left behind. Even though he tried to carry on with his daily tasks fixing the broken fences, tending to the livestock, his mind couldn't shake off the warnings in the letter. A constant feeling of anxiety gnawed at him, and with each step he took, everything felt heavier. Jack stood outside the farm, gazing down the path where Martin's car had just driven away. The faint rays of the evening light began to fade, and the surrounding area grew eerily quiet. But he didn't feel at peace. On the contrary, his heart was filled with unease. He opened the envelope again, rereading the lines he had skimmed over when Martin had just left. The veiled threats contained within were something he couldn't ignore. "If you refuse to cooperate, we will take legal action to seize your assets without prior notice." Jack knew that they weren't just making empty threats. They could follow through on what they promised, and that made him feel cornered. But there was no other choice. He had to take action. Even though the anger still simmered inside him, Jack understood that he couldn't keep living in fear and anxiety. He had fought in the military, faced harsh situations, and now it was time for him to confront a greater challenge, to defend his freedom, to protect his land ownership. No one has a right to control me, Jack thought to himself, and then he made his decision. He would not back down. If this fight was something he couldn't avoid, then he would fight to keep everything he had built. Jack began to prepare. He couldn't just rely on the security systems he had set up. He needed more than that. He needed a strategy that would make the HOA think twice before invading his life again. He walked over to the storage cabinet in the house and started pulling out the tools he would need. His laptop powered on, and he began researching the rural management program that Martin had mentioned. He dug into his old connections, reaching out for help from friends in police force and the military. He needed a plan to tackle the bigger schemes that the HOA might be plotting. One late afternoon, just as Jack finished fixing a livestock pen, a black SUV pulled up outside the farm. This time, Jack didn't just see a couple people. He saw a group of 4 individuals, all dressed in black, stepping out of the vehicle. They weren't your typical HOA staff. These people looked like they were trained, and the way they moved suggested they were on a mission. Without waiting long, Jack decided to go outside and head toward them. He didn't feel scared, but inside, he was hit with an unsettling feeling. This wasn't the first time the HOA had sent someone here, but this time felt much more serious. One of them, the team leader, looked at Jack and said, "We're here to conduct a routine inspection. All properties in this area need to be checked as part of the HOA's program." Jack stood firm, his gaze sharp. "This is my property, and I don't agree with what you're doing. You have no right to intrude here." The team leader stood firm. "We're not just here to inspect, Mr. Callahan. We're on a different mission, and you need to cooperate." From this person's attitude, Jack realized that they were not just a simple inspection team. This was part of a bigger plan, and they had no intention of stopping. "You guys can leave right now," Jack said coldly. "I don't want any more intrusions." The team leader looked at the others, then turned back to Jack. After a brief silence, he shrugged and said, "We're leaving, but you won't escape what's been set in motion." The others got back in the car, leaving Jack standing there, the tension still gripping him. He knew this confrontation wasn't over yet. Jack couldn't sit still any longer. He decided to reach out to an old friend from the police force, Deputy Dan, someone had served with in the military. Dan wasn't just a friend. He was also a respected figure in the community. Jack believed that with Dan's help, he would gain more insight into what the HOA was plotting. "Hey, Dan, I need your help," Jack said over the phone. "Something's not right here, and I feel like I'm being watched, threatened." Dan listened and then replied, "Just stay calm, Jack. We'll help you. Let's not put ourselves in a dangerous situation without a plan." After the conversation with Dan, Jack felt a bit relieved. At least he no longer had to face it alone. But he knew that this wouldn't be easy, and what was coming could change his life forever. A few days after his conversation with Dan, Jack was ready for the confrontation he felt was coming soon. With support from old friends in the police and military, Jack had gathered information about the rural management program that Martin Ellison had mentioned. It wasn't just a simple property inspection program. In reality, it was a massive campaign aimed at controlling land and assets in various rural areas, not just Jack's own. Jack kept preparing. He reinforced the security system, installed additional surveillance cameras, motion sensors, and automatic lighting around the farm. He also got tools and weapons ready to protect himself if the worst-case scenario happened. However, he didn't want to have to use them. He wanted to end this conflict with courage and strategy, not violence. On a foggy morning, Jack stepped outside, holding a cup of coffee just like any other day. But today, he felt that everything was different. The morning light didn't bring the usual sense of peace like it used to. Instead, it carried a sense of urgency, a preparation for a much bigger battle. "This is where I belong," Jack told himself, standing in the vast expanse of the farm, feeling a sense of determination within. "I won't let anyone take away what I built." About an hour later, the white SUV that Jack had seen before appeared again at the end of the trail. This time, it wasn't just a couple of people. There were 5 of them, all wearing HOA uniforms. Among them, Jack recognized Karen, the woman who came the first time to inform him about the HOA regulations. Karen stepped out of the car, this time with no trace of pleasantries, but instead with a serious demeanor, like a leader ready to confront an enemy. She walked towards Jack with decisive stride, showing no hesitation. Jack stood his ground, staring intently at her, showing no sign of fear. "Hello, Mr. Callahan," Karen began, but her tone was no longer sweet like the last time. This time, her voice was sharp and commanding. "We're here to carry out a mission on behalf of the HOA. This is your final reminder to comply with the community regulations." Jack didn't respond right away. He just stood there, staring at Karen for a long moment. He could feel the shift in the air, a sense of tension building with each passing second. "You can leave right now," Jack said, his voice firm, but there was no hint of fear. "I've warned you. I won't let you control my life." Karen wasn't too surprised by Jack's reaction. She simply looked at him and signaled for the others to come closer. "You don't understand," Karen said. "This isn't just a routine inspection anymore. The HOA has decided that your property needs to be taken over for the greater good of the community." Jack stepped forward, unafraid and unbothered. "I don't care about your reasons," he replied coldly. "You won't take what's mine." Silence envelopes the space. One of the HOA members steps toward Jack, and without saying a word, their gaze is filled with determination. Jack senses that the tension in this situation is so thick it could explode at any moment. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Karen signaled for her team to move in closer, but this time Jack was ready. He quickly pulled out his phone, texting Dan and a few friends in the police force, asking for their help. He knew this would be a pivotal confrontation. "You guys won't succeed," Jack said, gripping the cup tightly in his hand. "If you want to check my property, you need a court order. Otherwise, you won't be able to get in here." Karen showed no signs of wavering. "We don't need a court," she said, her tone icy. "This is an order from the HOA. You will have to cooperate." Jack began to feel that this tension couldn't last much longer. He had prepared everything to deal with the situation, but he never expected it to become this intense. The HOA members started moving toward him, possibly to take specific actions. "Enough already," Jack shouted. "I told you, you're not going to trespass on my property." At that moment, Dan's police cars appeared in the distance. The flashing red and blue lights lit up the night, and the vehicles came to a stop right near Jack's property. Officers stepped out, and this area was no longer just filled with HOA members. It was now a presence of law enforcement. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he couldn't let his guard down. This was just the beginning. "Karen, I called the police," Jack said, looking straight at Karen. "Let the law decide." The HOA members showed no hesitation. A few people in Karen's group exchanged worried glances, but Karen maintained her calm demeanor. She turned to Jack, her eyes unwavering. "You might think the police will help you," Karen said, "but you have no idea who you're up against. We have a bigger plan, and you're just a piece of it." Jack didn't respond. He just stood there, feeling each moment slip away, until the police arrived, asking the HOA members to leave the area. "Stop all actions immediately," one of the officers said in a strong voice. "If you continue, we will arrest you." Karen's team had no way out. They left in silence, without a word. Jack watched them go, the tension slowly easing, but he knew that this battle had only just begun. As soon as Karen's team left, a brief sense of relief washed over Jack. However, he knew all too well that this was just a pause in a battle that was far from over. The HOA members were not the type to back down easily. Jack turned to look at the police holding their ground, but deep down, he couldn't shake off an unavoidable sense of anxiety. "Jack, we're going to protect you," Dan said, his voice filled with determination. He stepped closer to Jack, looking into his weary eyes. "But you need to brace yourself. This isn't just your personal issue. If the HOA is involved in a big project like this, there are going to be people behind it, and they won't let you go easily." Jack nodded, feeling the truth in Dan's words. "I know, but I won't back down," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. "If they want to fight, I won't give them the chance to take over my life." In the following days, Jack, along with Dan and their friends in the police force, gathered information about the activities of HOA. It seemed like everything was just part of a larger plan, connected to some powerful organizations in the area. But what worried Jack the most was the presence of some big names backing HOA. Surely, if things weren't clarified, they wouldn't just stop at threats and control. They could resort to even worse actions. One evening, as Jack was sitting with Dan in the living room, his phone rang. It was a message from a friend in the military, someone Jack had been in touch with before. The message was just one line: be wary of the Rural Management Program. It's a long-term strategy aimed at changing the social structure of rural areas, not just here, but in many other places too. Jack read the message once more, a chilling sensation running down his spine. If this was true, then the HOA and those behind them weren't just looking to control the land. They were trying to take control of the entire community. This wasn't just a battle for property rights. It was a fight for personal freedom, for the power of the community. This is part of a bigger strategy, right, Dan? Jack asked, his eyes glued to the phone screen. Dan nodded. That's right. I've received information from people in the security forces. This isn't just an HOA issue. It also involves the schemes of powerful groups, possibly organizations from outside this area. If we don't act quickly, they'll continue to expand their influence. Jack stood up, a wave of tension rising within him. I can't let them control my life. It's time for us to fight back. That night, Jack spent the entire evening digging deeper into the organizations and strategies that the HOA might be employing. He found documents related to use of community organizations to infiltrate rural areas, create fake organizations, gather information, and even use security forces to coerce people into accepting the regulations they imposed. This meant that Jack was not just up against the HOA, but a larger organized network that could be part of a global conspiracy. Control starts with the smallest things, Jack thought to himself as he read through the documents. They want to create a society where everything has to follow their directives, and I can't let that happen. Jack started planning his counterattack. He reached out to his associates in the military and police to create a stronger defensive strategy. This time, he wasn't just protecting his farm. He also wanted to find a way to expose the conspiracy of the HOA and the organizations behind it. The next day, as the sun rose high in the sky, Jack and his team got ready for the decisive showdown. They knew that this time it wasn't just the HOA they were up against. There could be larger forces involved. Jack double-checked all the security equipment once more, making sure everything was ready. He also prepared the documents that proved the HOA's wrongdoing and their plans. In the middle of the afternoon, a black truck appeared again, but this time there were more people, not just the usual HOA staff. Strange faces, but all serious, stepped out of the vehicle. Jack knew that the moment had come. The HOA forces began to move into the farm. But this time, they couldn't easily do everything their way. Jack and his team were ready, and they weren't backing down anymore. It was a showdown not just over land ownership, but a fight for personal freedom, for the right to live in a society free from control. The confrontation was intense, but with the help of Dan and his team, Jack was able to handle the intruders. The police arrived just in time to arrest the HOA members and gathered all the evidence needed to expose the organizations behind the HOA. With the support of the authorities, Jack successfully protected his property and his freedom. The HOA was disbanded and their schemes were exposed. Jack felt as if a new door had opened, a place where he could live freely without the threat of organizations trying to control his life. Thank you all for taking the time to watch today's video. If Jack's story and his fight for personal freedom touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any inspiring videos from legendary narratives. We all have the right to defend our freedom and what we believe in. Remember, sometimes the biggest battle is standing up for yourself against forces that want to control your life. Thank you for being with us, and let's keep supporting inspiring, powerful, and meaningful stories. See you in the next video. Wishing you all a fantastic day.